Good afternoon, and welcome to this 2-hour plenary session on managing the soil nexus. My name's Camilla Toulmin, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session. Yesterday, we heard a lot about innovation in understanding the soil nexus, and tomorrow we'll be looking at how to stimulate opportunities for action in taking forward this thinking. But today, it's a question of management, how to draw together the insights, the scales, the actions, the arenas, which together can bring long-term sustainable land, water, soil management. Let me just say a couple of things about myself and the organization IIED that I've directed for the last 10 years. We call ourselves a think and do tank. We put ideas into action and we feed findings from action back into ideas. So very much at the heart of what I think we've been talking about yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And we work on climate, land, forest, water, food, cities, markets, and governance. And I should confess my own background in terms of my own doctoral work was very much around soils. I sat in a small village in central Mali, looking at how farmers and herders negotiated access to water and access to dung. Dung was right at the heart of relations between herders and farmers. So it's great to be back in a world talking about soils and nutrients. And for me, I'm really pleased to see such a diverse, mixed gathering of people around this agenda, because as you know, soils are always the richer for having multiple elements brought together and combined. And I could tell from the noise and from your tardiness, if I may say, in coming back after lunch, that you were having a good time, you were meeting, talking, discussing, arguing with people, and I think that's exactly what we're about over the course of these days. In this session, we'll hear from 4 people acting as thread ambassadors, reporting back briefly on workshops that they've participated in this morning. We also have 5 panel members to respond in dialogue with them and with me and with you, because we're very keen that this be as interactive and as engaged as possible. So let me encourage you to put up your hands with questions, comments, as early and as often as possible. I'll aim to control the timing, and I've got a big red clock down there, which will hopefully keep me on track. But first, let me introduce my panel. We have on the right Mujahed Ashuri, who is the new head of the Land and Water Division at FAO, and a committee member of the Global Soil Forum. We have Maria Betti, Director of the Institute for Environment and Sustainability at the European Commission's Joint Research Centre. We have Johan, and he told me how to pronounce his surname, but I won't get it right, Schulenschiener, how's that? Executive Director of the Stockholm Environment Institute, an organization which is very much a sister, a younger sister of IIED, based in Stockholm but working globally. We have Fon and So, who's coordinator of COMINSUD, which is the community initiative for sustainable development in Cameroon. And last but not least is Martin Yemifak, who is president of the African Soil Science Society and a senior research officer at IMRAD and UNESCO University in Yaoundé, also from Cameroon. And as I say, we've got 4 THREAD ambassadors. And what I'm going to do is to ask each of them to come up in turn, give a short feedback, and allow for some dialogue and questions with myself, the panel, and with you. So we'll go through one by one. And the first is Deborah Bossio, who's Director of Soils Research at CIAT, the International Centre for Tropical Agriculture, based in Nairobi. Yes. Deborah, you're very welcome. You've been following the material cycle stream in particular, so give us a short summary of what you heard this morning and how that fits into the broader agenda.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for the introduction, and nice to see everybody here this afternoon. We had a fantastic, I think it's working now.
Yeah.
A fantastic session this morning. It was titled Sustainable Soil Nutrient Management in Sub-Saharan Africa, Finding Common Ground. And what I want to start with really is we had quite a diverse group. We had people discussing the political side of the issue, Abuja Declaration, Abuja 2 coming up. We had people from agroecology, organic agriculture, from soil information, bringing the research side. And we also had a few representatives from industry, from fertilizer industry and input markets. So we were all in the same room together. And it's not possible to really capture really well the discussion. So what I wanted to do was share with you some quotes before I have just a few points of summary. One of the striking quotes of the day: if agriculture is the body, then soil should be the heart, and we tend to forget the heart. Balanced nutrition is the key to nourish people. You need to nourish people, you need to nourish the plants. Optimize and perhaps not maximize production. It's not a problem in investment per se, it's investing in the right inputs. Contextualize science-based evidence. This is Africa. We're not talking about Europe here today. Vermicompost is the word of the day in next generation technologies. Wise use is knowing your soils. Africa has a plan, and that plan is CADEP. Africa is rising. Africa is changing. There's momentum. So that's to give you a little bit of a flavor. And then we moved on to actually trying to identify common ground amongst all the different people who were there. And we have 3 areas that were really common ground. First, there seemed to be this dichotomy between mineral fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers, and organic materials. And that was sort of set up as the straw man of the session. And very quickly, it became clear that pretty much everyone agreed that it's not about organic versus synthetic, it's about a combination or integration of both, a complementary approach where both inputs are needed to build and maintain soil fertility. Another common ground issue was that wise use, which was a very common buzzword throughout the session, wise use applies both to organic and to synthetic inputs that you use in your systems. And also that science is really a driver that can be used through extension and also can set up the policies that can carry through extension activities. I think more exciting are the hot issues. I think we all probably agree on the common ground. That was what it was nice to find. But the hot issues, I have 4 that I want to mention. The first was subsidies. We had a lot of talk about fertilizer subsidies. And there were strong voices raised to suggest that we should subsidize the integrated package. We shouldn't subsidize necessarily only synthetic fertilizers, but you could also subsidize, for example, soil testing that would allow wise use of fertilizers, and even perhaps organic materials being available to smallholder farmers. There was a very strong call that to ensure benefits of these subsidies reach the smallholder farmers, we had to address really critical issues in the sort of institutional arrangement, the value chain and the leakage along that chain, because in often cases, the only real argument against subsidies is that actually it's not helping the smallholder farmers at all, so we need to address that issue. Another big issue was that there has been a very strong imbalanced bias towards nitrogen fertilizers as the main and important entry point, whereas we all know that we need actually a much more balanced approach to soil fertility management. Water came up several times, and mostly in the context of we're just simply not talking about it enough in this when we talk about soil fertility management. And then the last is waste to wealth, the urban issue the need to return nutrients from cities back to the farms if we really want to address sustainable soil fertility management.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Stay up here, Deborah,
Okay.
because we're fortunate in having Martin, who, as president of the African Soil Society, I'm sure has got questions to ask you. Maybe, Martin, you'd like to reflect on some of the points that Deborah's made.
Yeah.
Pick her up on some of the issues, the hot issues that she's outlined.
Okay. Thank you very much, moderator. As
You were there.
yes, I was there.
He
I
knows.
did a lot. I know what it did about. But I would like to make a comment on this issue, especially on the aspect of investment, because we know scientists work very closely with farmers in that area. And we know soil in Africa are very diverse and have different problems. But the reality is that the organic matter is the most important issue. Depleting because of the weather conditions is very quick depleting. And the issue is that research have done a lot of things to know what is possible to do. Farmers in their local condition, they also know a lot. That's why the system that I practice is based on the condition and they know very well. Because myself, I've been working in that area, following them to see what is happening in soil during the shifting cultivation system. When they cut a forest and crop and abandon the land to follow what is happening on the soil, I got the result. But I realized at the end that I cannot solve the problem myself because I did a lot, use very modern techniques to analyze the data and publish it. Very good scientific paper, I know. But at the end of the day, the problem is not solved. Farmers need integrated input. Organic matter, because if you don't bring in organic matter, mineral fertilizer alone will not solve the problem. We try also, in 2-3 years, there's no more response to input. And that's why integrated aspect is very important, but the source of organic matter is the most difficult one. And we need to bring in investment. And I like that part of investment you said, subsidy. Who has to bring in? The government, the business, who has to bring in this investment, this money? I think we should, from this panel, start thinking of how to build in a system or soil nutrient management system whereby you have stakeholders from science, from local, from business people, from the government. I don't know. This will be the most important thing. If this will be a possibility to integrate several people to a system that integrates several people where there will be company producing such organic matter input combined with mineral fertilizer, we will be able to manage soil in the sustainable way in the area. The challenge is that it's not only science, it's not only local, but we need to bring in several people in order to solve that problem, to have an integrated, really sustainable management of nutrient in soil. That's the first.
Yeah, I think that's a more detailed view of waste, basically the summary of the discussion that we did have, that there has to be ways to support an integrated approach to soil, which right now doesn't really exist in the current sort of structures of investment and subsidy.
I'm very glad that you raised the issue of subsidies as well, because people flag up Malawi as an example of somewhere that's broken the mold over the last 5-6 years in terms of subsidizing fertilizer. But others have said, but a huge part of the government budget is now being spent on subsidies. So what's the right amount?
Yeah, that's a good question that we didn't have time to get right into, although it did come up, because it was raised up as something that's really shocking to people to find out the percentage of the agricultural investment in many different countries can be, 30–40% of the whole agricultural investment is going into fertilizer subsidies. So the question is this really the right thing? Because if it's just about fertilizers, but you don't go into extension, you don't do these other things, maybe we should redirect those investments. And we didn't have a time to really go into it in detail, but we had a short discussion afterwards. The issue is that you can't take that percentage of investment in isolation, that it's just a fertilizer investment. That investment saves food import costs. It revitalizes the rest of the agricultural industry. So in Malawi, the story is much more complex than simply how much is spent on the fertilizer. It's how much surrounding benefit that the country's had. And many people think it's been very successful and very much worth that level of investment.
Yeah, yeah. I also wanted to ask you, there's been quite a lot of publicity about the sustainable rice intensification program that, again, divides people. There are some people who say it's magic, fantastic stuff. Other people say it's, there's no science behind it at all. I wondered what your view was of whether or not there's something really interesting going on there in terms of new ways of managing soil and planting density that is allowing for a much more sustainable, low-nutrient crop production taking place.
Yes, that's a very interesting question. I worked on this a little bit when I was with the International Water Management Institute, and I actually decided at some point that we shouldn't pursue it too much farther because it was so polarized. People had become religious about it. It's either you believed in the system of rice intensification or you didn't. And there was very little room for productive dialogue. I think there's a lot of potential there. It's basically a wet-dry system for rice so that you use less water is applied to the irrigation field. So you do save half of the water withdrawals when you use the system of rice intensification, and you also would reduce methane. So it's not that much different than what IIED is pushing for rice all over the world in terms of massive change that we're looking for in our rice systems. And when you add the components of organic inputs rather than synthetic and needing to hand transplant the rice, then it made it sound like it was a very marginal system only for very small holders on small plots. But I think there's a lot to be gained in that system if we can avoid this polarizing debate where there is these claims of 20 tons per hectare possibilities, which then scientists can't believe. It's the same as some of these other issues. If we can avoid the really polarized debate, we can really find the kernels of value in there, and I think there is.
Well, it's great also that, as you said, you managed to knock down that straw man and agree that it's always a question of a combination of different soil nutrients that are going to make the difference. I'd like to take a couple of questions, maybe people who'd like to ask Deborah. Yes, sir. There should be a microphone just coming.
Thank you. My name is Ratan Lal. I disagree with the idea of subsidy. I disagree with the idea of subsidy. Subsidies demoralize people. They are handouts. They are charities. Farmers are very, very self-respectful people. They should not be demoralized. They need help. They need support. And that's not through subsidy. That's through payments for ecosystem services. The world community owes them money for sequestering carbon, for improving water quality, for increasing biodiversity. And that's what they should be paid for, not handouts. Africa is rising. Sierra Leone had an increment GDP of 18%. Most countries had 10%. They need to be treated with respect. And the respect is you pay them what they deserve, what they earn. And they have earned restoration of natural resources, mitigating climate change, improving water quality. Pay them just price for what they do, not the handouts. This is about the time to forget the word subsidy.
Well, I want to take that more as a comment than a particular question to me, because I think this idea of subsidies, especially at national level, is certainly not my business. It's the business of national level policymakers and what they want to invest in terms of moving their countries forward. In the session, the subsidies was not 100% accepted there should be subsidies, although I would say from the members of the group who were from Africa, almost, I think it was unanimous, that we cannot say there should be no agricultural subsidies of any kind in sub-Saharan Africa, that agriculture in the US and in Europe and everywhere is subsidized. So it's much more about how do you target those subsidies to get the outcomes that you want. And your option, I mean, that's a reasonable option. You're not saying don't support agriculture. You're just saying doing it differently. And I think we probably have, I'm sure some other people have more to say.
Let me take one more. Yes, yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'll use the example of Nigeria. For decades, fertilizer was the bedrock of corruption. The current regime came in, and there was an electronic wallet system whereby, using mobile telephone, all the suppliers are registered, the farmers are registered, and the government still gives subsidy to smallholder farmers. When you receive your input, you send a message to a bank, and the bank will now wire the money into the account of the agent. So there's no loss in terms of resource, and those who need it get it. And in 2012, that increased the amount of food produced by Nigerian smallholder farmers up to about 50%. In other words, you are talking of over 3 to 4 million tons of cereals. So I think if it's well targeted, subsidy is not wrong. Europe still subsidizes their farmers. America does it to the extent of maybe 365 billion a year. Come on, let's do what is good and do it right. Thank you.
So, yeah. There was a quote that I didn't use from the session. It was, if you canceled subsidies in Nigeria, it would overthrow the government. So obviously it's a very, very strong point. And your success case there was also brought up. That's a very important success case of how you manage the subsidies. It doesn't really address one issue that came up quietly from the Tanzania case, which was that the vast majority of the money is going into the suppliers and the transport and corruption along the way, and very, very little even reaching. So this is something that maybe Nigeria has sorted out, but other places have not been able to sort out. How do you get the benefit, the bulk of the benefit going to the smallholder farmer in particular?
Great. Well, it's interesting to see that example of how Nigeria has managed on this fertilizer subsidy front. Of course, it's been more difficult in terms of abolishing the fossil fuel subsidy, but that's not a debate from here and now. We'll do that at another time. Well, thank you very much, Deborah. I know that our colleague Martin has got a question he wants to throw into the mix, but we'll wait until we get to the panel at the end of the thread presentations. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Our next thread ambassador is Walter Erdelin, who is the former Assistant DG of Natural Science at UNESCO. And as a thread ambassador, he says he can't weave, but he can crochet. So, Martin, please, Walter, please come and.
So, we're all labeled, by the way. So, let me first and foremost try to give you a summary. Actually, it's not really a summary. It's not even an abstract. It's just bullet points, because we had a highly compact, diverse, I'm tempted to say biodiverse, and rich and lively debate this morning under the topic Soils and Land in the Sustainable Development Goals, a proposal for global targets and indicators. So my thanks first to the members of the team, Martha, Matthias, Alexander, and Yvonne. It's a joint product, as I indicated, that I'm going to present now. It's not surprising to answer the question, what was surprising, with not surprisingly, comma. There are several groups indeed working on the topics of soil and land for the SDGs. And this is in fact due to the momentum that came up shortly after the Rio Plus 20 summit, and the Rio Plus 20 summit specifically in the context of, and I quote, in the context of striving to achieve a land degradation neutral world in the context of sustainable development. Now, there are different perspectives to the thematic areas to be discussed. We need, right from the beginning, to be clear about the terminology to start with, a common ground and a common understanding. And we need to use established language. We would like to communicate and reach the recipient. Even with the different perspectives I just highlighted, there's common ground on the topics of land and soil for the SDGs, and also for other processes like the post-2015 development agenda. We discussed whether, for instance, one clear indicator could be developed that resembles what we discuss under the so-called 2-degree target within the context of global climate change. We also had an interesting point that was the importance of the mass and social media to be included into the messages that we are going to jointly develop, so that we reach out and have the media as an additional capacity reach out on board. Very importantly, we need to link the interlinkages between what we all discuss. We talk about soil, food, energy, water, biodiversity, and so forth, and use the interlinkages to make the case for the soils. And these interlinkages are not just conceptual ideas, but they are key to human well-being. Interestingly, we talk about issues like productivity and others in agricultural systems, but the question is, there's a temptation to get lost in terminology, and a common umbrella term that was agreed upon, if I got it correctly this morning, was to use ecosystem services. We need to find science-based definitions, but we are not looking into developing new and, in particular, longer-term research programs. This is way beyond. This may be needed, but this is not what we should discuss right now. We had a chain with stakeholder elements like the scientists, the policymaker, and the farmers. And I had the impression this is very frequently seen too static. It is a dynamic arrangement where you have interactions amongst all three groups. And this interaction is highly dynamic and should be used in a process of co-production of knowledge as a key element for our final discussion and for getting in concrete ways into developing the contribution, the soil-related contribution to the SDGs. And of course, the knowledge is not knowledge per se. It is knowledge that is truly action-oriented that we would like to develop. Now, there's a need that was clearly understood to bring the initiatives present at this very Global Soil Week together into one joint process and invite further partners to join in. So it's highly dynamic, and we try to get additional capacity on board in the process of developing concrete things like indicators, further work on targets, and so forth. Now, it was proposed to establish a working group for indicators. This now gets us into the process for soils and land in the context of this week, and frankly speaking, in the context of a few days, a working group that should get started and meet the relevant timelines that are just ahead of us. Now, timelines, you know, there's a global discussion ongoing within the overall SDG process. We need to think about what can be agreed upon and achieved, and not in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, but by the end of this very week. And secondly, that we come up with a proposal of this working group that should be included in the document that you all know, the agenda for action of this Global Soil Week 2013. We cannot wait. The SDG process is on the way, so we need a high degree of proactivity as we are under an enormous time pressure. And you know, we need to get our act together, we need to produce things, and as you know, it is not business as usual, it is business as unusual, and it is cutting edge at the same time. Now finally, it was agreed that we need targets and indicators, but there are different ways on whether we need many indicators, only one. This is one thing that still needs further debate. So there'll be another workshop on Thursday that would deepen the debate, and finally, we would like to know the reaction of the plenary to this overall way of going ahead, and if the plenary would agree with the basic principles just outlined, we would see into what it would mean to build additional partnership and to go ahead with these further partners. I would conclude, Madam Chair, if you allow, with a quote, which I like very much. Don't hesitate to go too far. The truth lies beyond it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, stay up here. Well, thank you very much. I think that is both very ambitious, but also very practical in terms of trying to come up with one clear single indicator that can be taken forward into the debate. I think we've all been impressed, I think, at how much these MDGs and associated indicators have really made a difference in a number of places because they've allowed citizens, civil society groups, donors, different bits of government to start to measure much more clearly what they're actually achieving rather than how much they're spending on a particular thing. Absolutely. And I think that it's a very good reminder of whoever it was said, you know, you've got to measure something. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And if you can't measure it, then it doesn't matter. And so I think finding ways in which you can boil down the complexity of soil management, sustainable land management, the whole next series of Nexus questions, boiling that down to something very simple, while it might offend our intellectual sensibilities, I think does allow us to respond to a very pressing political imperative. Now, I wonder if I can ask somebody from our panel whether, Johan, would you like to talk about how the 2015 agenda responds to some of SEI's priorities?
Well, I don't want to talk about that, if that is okay.
That's okay.
Because at least what I felt in this case, it was, you know, if I could just ask a couple of questions. I also attended the session. Of course, I have a lot of comments and ideas and so on, but I tried, you know, I saved them for later in that case, since we are now with the SRED ambassadors. One thing that really, you know, was partly discussed but didn't really get onto the table of approach was, okay, we may need a dedicated goal, but on the other hand, we also know that all other targets and goals will somehow influence on soil and land. What do you sense came out of the discussion in that regard? How can we have an integrated approach while at the same time, from a political point of view, try to achieve to get a single target? Do you have an idea what we came to as a conclusion in our discussion?
Yeah, my feeling was if you use the terminology integrated approach, you just inject another word, which is integrated adaptive approach. So we have a unique expertise here with us. So we go ahead with the discussions and come up with concrete results. But we should not cast this in any sort of heavy metal, iron or whatever, but be dynamic and flexible. Because whatever we come up with here may not be the entry point as it finally boils down within this overall SDG process.
And another aspect there, though, because I mean, one of the ideas about moving from the MDGs to the SDGs that I find very fascinating and also interesting from our organization is, of course, that it actually becomes globally relevant. MDGs are focusing very much on poverty. Now we are suddenly putting responsibilities on us, the interdependencies, the drivers of change from consumption, the fact that we are more and more globalized. We talked about virtual water, we talked about virtual soil, I think, and so on. Did you assess that we managed in our discussion to broaden the agenda that way, or do you sense that we still get stuck a little bit in focusing on the basics rather than the broader sustainability agenda?
Well, maybe it's a very positive interpretation. My feeling was we did focus on the soils, but at the same time recognized the landscape of our discussion. And again, we should take on board, I mentioned the interlinkages. So we shouldn't isolate our debate from the overall debate and be cognizant of what it means that whatever comes up within the SDG context, especially at the lower levels in terms of targets and indicators, that is something we have to somehow work with. Because we finally cannot say, at least at this stage, to what extent this group may be able finally to influence this intergovernmental process towards the SDGs. But again, I mentioned the language. I think this was a very important point, because if you use the right language, which may not be the right language in absolute terms, but it is the language that functions in the UN context, then we have a very powerful starting point to really get not only our message that we're going to develop over the coming months across, but it would finally boil down into an element, into this whole sort of framework of SDGs, including targets, sub-targets, and so forth.
Okay, thank you. That's sort of my questions. But just also to say, I fully agree that it was one of the most interesting SDG discussions I have attended, because we really managed to have a very comprehensive discussion. So,
and it felt very grounded, didn't it?
It
felt very grounded. I think that there are times when I wonder whether it's money well spent to discuss the whole global agenda, because you can pass your entire life and that of all of your colleagues flying around to one meeting after another about MDGs, SDGs, post-2015. Yes. But I think thinking about how we can boil that down to one simple message, and then maybe finding a few champion governments that are willing to take that into the negotiation process and really push it hard and understand, as we heard, the language in which you have to frame it for it to be heard in the right kind of way by the UN negotiators. Okay, I'd like to throw it open for a couple of questions from the floor. Who'd like to come in on this particular topic about looking forward to the SDGs and what we can bring to that? Yes. Joan, is that? Yeah.
Thank you, Camilla, and thank you for the presentation. One of the debates that I have heard that may be of concern, at least in Africa, is a concern that the SDGs discussion is happening outside of the continent. And the implications, though, is that the goals are not set for many others other than developing countries in many instances. It may not be the case with sustainable development context, but it is the case with a lot of other areas maybe. And so the question I have is, if we set a working group that looks like this, my concern then will be what validation process there will be when you bring these issues then to the global agenda, because we may face some opposition on that. The second thing I wanted to point out is that, there is a process already discussing SDGs indicators relating to land governance, and I think you're aware of that. And how would that link then to this group here?
Okay.
Would you like to?
Yeah, first and foremost, I sincerely hope you're not right that we would embark or continue on a process that, if I may put it this way, again leaves Africa behind, at least to some extent. And secondly, I think the key issue is to meet your opponent in time. So whenever we would face a certain resistance or be cognizant of other views or any other developments that would interfere with what will be developed here, then this exchange should happen early. And you may recall, with regard to the UN representatives here, there's already a very powerful nucleus from which to build on. Now the question is how we translate this into two things. One is extending the partnership. As I said, we will take partners on board, but of course only supposedly that the plenary would agree to that. But secondly, also the group and its products would interact, if I may, with the outside world. And this must be done conceptually and strategically in a very clever manner. Unless you do it this way, you may have the best product and it will not work. So it's a question of diligence and sort of maybe also diplomatic and other arrangements with the overall process that is ongoing. And I would also recommend, because this is a very critical issue, to look at a very early stage into how you're going to communicate your product to the overall process.
Great. Well, as you say, and as Johan was pointing out, the thing about the SDG process, which is completely different from the MDGs, is that it is intended to be global and universal, so that our management in Europe of soils is just as much a focus for monitoring and reporting as the management of soils in the so-called developing world. So I wondered if at that point I could ask Maria to say something about how the European Commission was intervening in this. To what extent is the EC happy to be subject to this kind of global governance? Because I know quite a lot of governments are already pushing back because they don't want to have that.
Thank you very much, Camilla. The Commission is very keen to go in this process of global issues, above all for the soil management. Is very important for us because there is a gap, of course, if you look at sustainability between the characterization of soil and the land productivity. So we have to look at the information, that global information that we can have about soil characteristics, how we can fill this gap, and then to have a sustainable use of the land resources and of the soil use in this sense. But we have also to take in mind the question of the biodiversity of soils that you have, the degradation of soils, and also to see how we can protect the part of the soils that are still fertile and from the degradation. So this is also important, and for this we need information to a global extent. I would like also to mention the question of the climate change. We have to consider in the context also of climate change what is going to happen on the soil and how we can sustain in the sustainable manner to consider the protection and the valorization of the soil, above all the exploitation for the agriculture use. But not only, you have also to consider the urban development and the rural development. So we have many points of view that you have to consider together in an integrated manner, as we said before, and in a holistic manner and in a sustainable manner. So this, I think, is the directions that we are taking.
Great. Well, thank you, Maria.
Thank you.
Thank you, Walter.
Okay, pleasure. Thank you very much.
Well, our third thread ambassador is Iris Kreber, who's a food security advisor at DfiD and has been particularly associated with the whole G8 presidency that the UK has had over this last year, focusing on a series of land governance issues. So, Iris.
Thank you very much. I had the pleasure to not attend, but report about two working groups. One was about integrated governance for energy security and sustainable land use. And the other one, and that I had the pleasure to attend, was balancing trade-offs and how to assess virtual land imports and water and CO2, etc., etc. Now, the first question that we thread ambassadors are supposed to answer is, what was surprising? What surprised me, in a sense, was that those two panels tackled highly political questions with almost all being researchers and no policymakers in the room. So we had to answer a question at the end, what next? I think that is the answer already. The next step is to open towards those who need to deliver the change. Because what was also surprising for me working in policymaking was there are lots and lots of good methodologies that can be used for a lot more than they are currently being used for. And they are there today. So that was something that came together in both groups. What was also surprising was that there was a bit of argument. One group decided I would say in a typical researcher mood, we don't have enough up-to-date data, we don't have enough quality data, we need more data. The other group said, well, yeah, but we have enough data to know what the next steps should be and to have a clear message. So again, I think that there's something in there where the next steps are pretty clearly set out. What was also interesting was that one group decided there's absolutely no coherence in international policies regarding trade and environmental agreements. As a policymaker, I would ask, why should there be? Or, so what? So what's the next step again? And one group discussed very long, as I said, the virtual land imports and how this can be assessed and how virtual water imports, CO2 impacts can be assessed. And I was completely struck by the multitude of rather similar, excellent methodologies to do this. What also surprised us was that most of these methodologies are very well able to assess the environmental impacts with sometimes somewhat unreliable data, but the conclusions are still pretty clear. But at the moment, there is no assessment of the social and political impacts. So that's something that, in my limited understanding, should be easy to add. What surprised me personally was that in all these discussions, there was absolutely no mention of the political economy. Why do we know so much, and why do we have such excellent methods and methodologies, but no policy change? Often not at the national level, not at the regional level, and certainly no coherence at the international level. And the most interesting question then would be, how do we get there? I already answered the second question. Were promising approaches discussed? I would say yes and no. We have all the tools at hand. We need to use them. We maybe need to use them to assess a few more effects and impacts than we are currently doing. But we also need to broaden the discussion, because as long as researchers work among themselves and deliver wonderful results, that's fine, but the research isn't being used. And the dissemination is necessary, and one recommendation was to use governments to facilitate stronger dissemination of research results. But still, you can lead the horse to the water. The question is, how do you make it drink? So how do we develop and deliver the policy change? So in sum, were there areas of disagreement? Since I'm summarizing two groups, yes, there were and there weren't. So you have this age-old question, we need better data before we can act, but we do know enough to set out the path forward. So how do we get people on this right path? There was also quite some discussion about virtual imports possibly being reduced through better efficiency in our own countries. And I remember you had this statement about, oh, we're not talking about Europe here, we're African, or vice versa. This is where the crunch lies, where everything is connected. And can we, for example, in Europe, be more efficient and reduce virtual imports? Well, I think from the discussion I learned, yes, we can. But how do we get to better efficiency in our own home areas as well? So there is a whole load of interesting points that were discussed in both groups, but at being the ambassador, I take the liberty of summarizing these two densely filled pages a little bit more briefly. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Iris. If I may pick you up on the political economy issues, because I think we're very often in that space of there often even being good policy, but it's not implemented because there are all sorts of barriers to that. People prevent it happening, interests get in the way. I wondered if I could ask Fon, who's for whom political economy and the trying to support the rights, particularly of communities against the interests of more powerful elites, that's his bread and butter. So I don't know, Fon, if you'd like to give us your thoughts on why rights are such an important part of trying to manage the nexus of land, of food, of natural resources.
Yes, that's very important. And when you have this presentation, I just have this question. What security guarantee is high-level policy and scientific community offering to vulnerable segments of the population which can protect their livelihood and give hope for moving out of poverty. I think for many decades we've been talking about how to move vulnerable communities out of poverty, and there's big science investment in science, there's big discussions at the political level. But at the end of the day, we always see that there is a hijack. There is a hijack because to the intermediary level, the whole policies are discussed and scientific information come out, decisions are made, but the poverty keeps deepening. But again, we're living in a context now of rights. And we've come to realize that without rights, then we move to a world of cannibalism. I mean, it's quite an extremist word of use, cannibalism, because the stronger ones will even want to thrive at the expense and the blood of the weak ones. So rights actually is what is holding the balance. And in all of these new discussion paradigms, paradigms is the word that has been used inside here. How to change, how to shift the positions, how to be more smarter. So what can we find as the security guarantee? This one I would throw out. Actually, we have the context of rights which have been developed. Is it enough?
Well, Iris, with your background in questions of governance.
Can I remind us, one of the working groups was called Balancing the Trade-offs. And my question was the immediate trade-off between what and for whom, and who's going to pay the price for what. And I think that's a little bit the elephant in the room. We know very well how to measure, and I've just learned a whole host of new methodologies how to measure impact, but we didn't get to the value-based political question on who is going to pay the price, and will we step back in the developed world in order to do exactly what Fon said, help people in developing countries lift themselves up more, or where will the trade-off fall? And I think if I can summarize our discussions this morning, we know that trade is now a globalized matter, but transparency and accountability for what happens around this trade is not. And maybe we should go to a situation where transparency and accountability are also being globalized, so that people know what's happening in both countries when we're talking about export trade, and they have a right to speak up and to claim their rights. And that's something where we're still a bit far away. But it's also the reason why at this year's G8 we made transparency the priority, because, well, if we don't know about it, we can't argue, we can't claim anything. So that's step one. It's a necessary step, but in itself it's not sufficient. But we need to make it.
Well, absolutely. It's been fascinating. I don't know how many of you have been following what's been happening in the UK and the apparent non-payment of tax by some of the world's largest companies. Finding that information out has created a political buzz in a way which just wasn't the case before. And I think, as you say, Iris, transparency, getting access to information that actually you can use in a political space to shame some of these big companies is a very important part of trying to achieve that change. Can I take maybe a couple of questions from the floor? Is it the after lunch snooze time?
One more aspect from our discussion.
Yeah, I'll let you come back. Yes, so one here. The mic is just coming.
Thank you very much. I think we do have trade, we do have international businesses and so forth. But at the end of the day, all those are using natural resources. Is it water, is it air, like pollution and so forth. So my thinking was that should really be part and parcel of the trade rules and laws to say you should take care of the environment. Because we've been really getting a free ride in terms of our building our economies, getting more money and so forth. But somebody is having to pay to account. Whether it's virtual water, virtual land, or whatever, somebody is paying. And we do see even in negotiations, land use change, and forestry and climate change, the blame is on the developing countries who produce some of these goods to say you are not using your land use properly, so forth and so on. So I think international trade should really start to account. Not just shame them, but really take account of all these costs. Somebody is paying, really.
Can you just say who you are so that people know?
Oh, Julius from Botswana.
Great.
Julius Atropin from Botswana, yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, Fon, Iris, do you want to come back on that?
Absolutely. But you also reminded me of what a colleague from Brazil said, where, that gets me back to transparency and accountability, where with all the international processes we're having, whether it's trade or primary investment, et cetera, we need to know what's happening. And that can be negative, and we hear a lot about the negative stories these days, but it can also be positive. Our Brazilian colleague said, well, look at those investments. If we didn't have them, we wouldn't have human development, we wouldn't have social development. I would imagine a situation where we use the methodologies we have to measure all the impacts, and that's for me the trade-off, and then weigh the pros and cons and see what the best solutions are. And that's the $64,000 question, then we convince global leaders to integrate the best possible targets and indicators into a post-2015 framework. At the moment, I think we have all the bits and pieces, but they're not coming together yet. And that there's some work for this group and others to do to take this forward.
Fine, I know that you wanted to come back.
Yeah, so we're discussing about within the framework of the SDGs, and looking at communities and their rights. I think new paradigms are coming up, probably better developed in Asia, but also being reflected in some parts of Europe now. But it should be a model which should be thought about also in Africa, how to promote social business enterprises. If you have the land and the soil, which is typically the capital of the poor, and it's part of the attraction also for some investors, how can we find good ways of negotiating win-win approaches where both communities and investors find common grounds? So all of the aspect of land grab and the negative connotations that go along with it will actually be averted, because in as much as communities will never or sometimes enough transform the resources or the reserves at their disposal to make wealth, big investors can really find good options. And yesterday we shared this discussion in our working group, our dialogue group, and you have one person who goes in your community and want to invest in that community with the community as part of the community. So I think this is one of the issues that we should think about.
Well, indeed. Of course, I was interested to hear you say win-wins while you spoke about trade-offs. I'm always a bit suspicious about win-wins because I think quite often they hide a much more complex balance of benefits and costs, and also hide big asymmetries in power between big investors and communities. One more question from the floor. Who'd like to? Yes, sir. The mic coming.
Yeah, Michael Bruntre from German Development Institute. If you have talked about all these instruments, what I hear instruments were, for example, on virtual water, virtual soil, and you said it is only a small step towards impact. And I would doubt that a little bit, because if you say that we do not know whether such a trade, if we import goods in the West from developing countries, can we really be sure that an import of virtual water is negative? We assume that. It always sounds as if that is a bad thing, instead of saying what is really happening to produce the goods in the South. I think that is the decisive question, is not whether we import from the South, but in what ways it is produced. And I'm very suspicious of all these balances, these footprints, ecological footprints, which do not answer this question, but which just account for the number of hectares that we presumably use in the South.
I would say that the whole debate about land use and land use change and footprints and life cycle impact assessments is value neutral. It just says we need to know more about what the impact is and what the use change is, whether it's positive or negative. At the moment, we are not really bothering to know very much. So I agree with you, it can be positive, it can be negative. At the moment, I don't know really.
Johan, a view on virtual land imports? Anybody else want to pick up on virtual land imports?
I mean, one question I think, I mean, what it raises, and I don't know if you discussed that, because it's of course extremely important, although I agree with you. I mean, we take the approach that this is negative, that of course trade, exchange of goods and services is something we always done. And we of course, if we move ahead to 2030, we move to a middle class of maybe 6 billion people, which is really going to be the main driver rather than population growth. Trade will increase. The interdependencies between countries will increase. The question is, of course, the issue of externalities. Sorry, doesn't work. Okay. The question is, of course, the issue of externalities. And one thing I haven't heard it so much in this conference, and I know that our EU colleagues, they know a lot about this, is the issue of policy coherence also between different aspects when we now, when we get into the trade issue and so on. Did this come up at all in the discussion?
That's why I said I was struck by the total absence of a discussion on the political economy. And that's what it's all about. Policy is not coherent, but why is it so? And how can we make it more coherent? We don't need to know what needs to happen. We've got it coming out our ears from all the conferences. We know what to do. But the interesting thing is how to make it happen.
Yeah. No, and I think that's particularly true on the climate change front now.
Yeah.
It's a question of politics. It's a question of interests. We know what needs to be done, but it's not getting done at the moment because we aren't making enough of a noise. So I think we need to make more of a noise to put pressure on our political masters to make that change happen. Professor Lal, did you want to?
I just want to make one more example of the land, virtual land, for example. The energy security that your group discussed, obviously biofuel is a very important equation. By 2020, 20% of the transport fuel must come from bioenergy sources. One example of the land virtual trade is the oil palm production in Malaysia on draining of peatlands. And we know that deforestation and draining of peatland creates a soil carbon debt that will take decades to repay, even with that biofuel prices, which are not accounted for.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think it's as much as anything about how these commodities are produced rather than whether they're produced and traded. But as our world becomes ever more globalized, I think those issues will squeeze the resources tighter and tighter. Iris, did you want a last word?
Well, I intentionally avoided discussing biofuels because that was obviously a big area of disagreement, and I would rather want us to get a bit more to the bottom of trade-offs in general than getting hooked on the very ideological biofuels debate. But ultimately, it is about scarce resources, and we're coming from and still living in a quite unbalanced world with people having different levels of access to their basic rights. And that's something we need to take into consideration because it's probably going to get worse, not better.
Thank you.
But I want to end with a positive note. I think we've had a lot of discussion about the post-2015 framework. I think that's the greatest opportunity that our generation has to do well and to build on the success of the MDGs and to be pragmatic yet a bit principled to get a manageable framework agreed that will focus attention and funding.
Good. Well, that's a very good note on which to end. Thank you very much, Iris. So, principled but pragmatic. Now, I think a lot of these issues look very different in a world where we recognize that there are planetary boundaries than they did perhaps 10, 15, 20 years ago, and where that sharing of resources, sharing of space is ever more critical. Our last thread ambassador, who's been sitting there very patiently, is Pablo Pachero, who's principal scientist at CIFOR, the Center for International Forestry Research. Pablo, you've taken responsibility for the thread on sustainable land management and soil engineering, so we'd love to hear back from you on what you learnt this morning.
Yes, well, I will report on two sessions. One is on the sustainable land management, and the other one is on social engineering. And actually what I found, soil engineering, sorry. And what I found interesting is probably these two groups, they should talk more together because they are coming from two different perspectives, but I think they share something which is interesting. And at the end can be summarized on this phrase, linking new technologies with traditional knowledge. So the two groups are asking about what are the possibilities to link scientific knowledge, but one of the groups is more thinking from the technologies perspective, and to linking with traditional knowledge. And also the second question, important question that they have, and it's also a very old question, is how to link all this knowledge and how to inform policy and practice. So these are very old questions that have been in the table for years. So, and the issue is to what extent we are able to move in finding new responses to these questions. So from the soil engineering perspective, they are looking at several issues or approaches or technologies that they think can make a difference. So, for example, closed nutrient cycling systems, wastewater usage technologies, adaptation of machineries to new management systems, integrating traditional knowledge into modern approach. So it's coming from this pure technical background, but they are trying to broaden up and to expand this concept. And so they are saying probably it could be much better to phrase this discussion in terms of engineering the soils. So, and the other group that is more thinking from the sustainable land management perspective, well, they started the debate with trying to come up with this a bit stereotypes of perspectives about what's the indigenous or traditional knowledge value versus what are the values from the scientific knowledge. And we know that the indigenous or traditional knowledge has the value because it's probably very consistent about, but it's very site-specific, but it's a cumulative knowledge. And the scientific knowledge, well, you know, you're a community of scientists, it has the advantage to extrapolate. So quickly, these groups, they come up with the, well, it's obvious, no, that recognizing the advantage of the need to integrate these two types of knowledge. Also taking the local specific indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge that could be enhanced and enlarge the applicability of this knowledge to broader scales. From here, there has been the discussion about, well, if we are able to integrate these two knowledge perspectives, so what do we do in terms of moving forward? And there has been this debate of transfer, but quickly the group recognized that it probably is much better to talk about sharing knowledge, which is a transfer. It's not it's a unidirectional concept, so we need to work with bidirectional communication concepts, but also that's important to rely on networks that can be actively working on the ground. And the importance that there has to be an open access to monitoring data. So the data that the scientific community produces has to be open. So, but however, there has been some disagreements about what would be the type of messages that have to be delivered from the scientific community. And there has been some discussion in one of the groups saying, well, we should put a bit more negative emphasis on the messages, and some other groups saying we need to be more optimistic and to be more positive and to engage more and other groups of the society. And also there has come up this view that it seems that now the whole debate from the soil science community is really moving forward, no, to embracing more concepts on sustainable management and going beyond these pure concepts of productivity. And probably this is a way also to link back to the possibilities with the traditional knowledge is offering, which is much more holistic, you know, in terms of how resources are managed. And also in terms of the other question about how to build the bridges with the policy, well, also it has been a different perspectives because you have more optimistic perspectives about the possibilities to inform policies, but you have the skeptics, you know, saying, well, there can be plenty of policies out there, but the problem is implementation and enforcement. So whatever we can do, reality is not going to change. So we need to embrace a much wider group of society, which makes a lot of sense to me. And probably I will end saying that, for example, in the Malawi case, they were saying that since the 90s, they adopted all these paradigms of sustainable development. They put all the policies in place and regulations, but at the end, the ones who are going to decide how resources are going to be allocated are not going to be the ministries of environment who were working very hard on putting these laws, but it's the Ministry of Finance.
Mm-hmm.
I will end up on that point.
Thank you. Can I ask you, because I don't think I've heard from anybody yet anything about conservation agriculture and the extent to which that as a form of soil management is, I suppose it's one of those things that some people think, is absolutely the route that's going to save us from climate change, that's going to sequester loads of carbon. What's your thinking about conservation agriculture in terms of no-till in particular?
Well,
is this something that you see as offering a solution everywhere, or is it rather specific in terms of where it gives you answers?
Well, I don't see that conservation agriculture. Well, I think can be solutions for some specific cases and could bring possibilities to do a proper management of resources and even to bring benefits for some groups or communities that are practicing conservation agriculture. Well, this concept has extended, and so you have now this low tillage system practices with large-scale agriculture as well. But in my perspective, I see the limitations probably of conservation agriculture, but that's not necessarily a field in which I'm working. But in my perspective, it's more looking at what the economic threats from large-scale expansion agriculture that could be placing some limits to conservation agriculture. But I think there are initiatives that are emerging at the global level as well, trying to promote that type of agriculture and looking at different scales, from the global scale to the national scale, putting policies in practice as well, and also valuing conservation agriculture, which could be also linked to the cultural identity of smallholders and communities who are practicing that type of agriculture. So that also requires a change in policy paradigms to promote that type of agriculture and to expand the possibilities of that agriculture.
Well, I was wondering if we could bring in Mujahed on that point, and particularly in relation to how you build these bridges between traditional knowledge in the agricultural sphere.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentation. I'm sorry for the voice. I came just today, maybe I missed the background discussion. Now, before going to SLM and soil engineering, what I heard several times is linkages and interlinkages. And I guess I had a chance to be, before coming as director of land and water, I was an FAO representative in a country, a big country, where land and water are very important, Egypt, when we talk about soil and water. And to me, when we talk again about policy and policy change, or policy making and policy change, I felt sometimes like there are even, to some extent, conflicting policies. When you go from water to soil, to food, to energy. And we did a small exercise, as an FAO exercise, in fact, as a policy advisory board for food security. And it was very difficult to bring all those concerned by food security. When we start talking about food security, they felt that it's agriculture. And they were really reluctant to bring on board the others. But in fact, later on, you can identify and find out that all, in fact, several sectors and several stakeholders are involved in this. And to me, if really we are talking about SDGs or how to influence member countries, there is a work which has to be done at the level of the countries, because policies, or let's say political side, they are listening, but I think that some work should be done from our side to reach what some colleagues, they call today a better or a common understanding. This is, to me, it's very, very important, I guess, really, if we would like to talk to this. And these policies that we heard that sometimes we have several policies, but again, what policies are there? How these policies they were developed, who was involved in developing these policies, And this is why sometimes, I mean, we need really, again, even we, in SLM, we've been working in this for years. We worked about integrated approaches, and there's several approaches that you find integrated. I mean, I worked several years in integrated watershed management, and I like landscape management. And we talk about the upstream, downstream relationships. And especially when it comes to water, I guess, when we started working maybe 40 years ago, talking a little bit about water, people, they started working about water, and then they find out when they built the dams, they were silted with soil because they didn't think about the soil and water, how they can go together. And this, instead of filling the dam with water, it was filled with soil. And this is, again, something that later on, when it comes to this issue of investment, people, they understand that we have to invest in both. Not in water, because we need both of them. And these days, of course, I mean, numbers are talking. We are talking about increasing food by 60% from now to 2050. We are talking about 2 billion people more. And I guess these are maybe indicators or targets that we can use for the future. Maybe just to finish by the initiative that all of you know, and maybe all of you contribute to, we see the Global Soil Partnership. I see Alexander, who is here, and Parvez, I guess. This is an opportunity, and this is an initiative, to me, which can be maybe promote what we are talking about. We have also opportunities that are coming in the near future. On 5th of December, we have the World Soil Day, and we are working with the UN General Assembly on 2015 as the International Year of Soils. So these are opportunities, and I think there is a momentum, and I'm happy to see that the soil is back on the agenda, and we need to use these opportunities. And thanks.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And I think the example of investment in dams is a perfect metaphor, if you like, for how everything is interconnected. And indeed, when you look at some of these big dams that have really lost half, 2/3 of their capacity and have now turned a sort of milky coffee color, you realize that there's been a lot of short-term thinking. I'd like to turn maybe to the audience for a couple of questions to Pablo. Anybody want to? Parvez.
Yeah, yesterday and last night, particularly, we talked about Nexus, water, food, energy nexus. And this morning in the debate we had, definitely we have a more important, a higher level maybe nexus that we should look at it, is policy, institution, and knowledge nexus. This is something really should come in complementarity with other nexus, and definitely we need to look at the knowledge, since we had this session on knowledge. How can we use the knowledge in order to move policies and in order to change institutional settings? Because from my perspective, one of the biggest problems we have in many countries are the institutional settings, which are each institution compete for resources within the ministries of finance, and often they are counterproductive, go against each other. Maybe this invention of having ministries, and so many ministries, is something to rethink about it. And if we want really to change certain things, we should really look at the examples of integrated approach by farmers, by communities, that they bring everything together in order to be able to sustain their livelihood. So policy livelihood, if you could call it, needs some different type of institutional setting that we have now. And that we have not really been talking too much about it.
Well, I think that's a point that we'd all very firmly agree with, and also that I think, as our previous thread argued, that we need to move away from talking to ministers of agriculture and of environment and talk to ministers of finance and prime ministers, because they're very often the people who hold the purse strings and decide how priorities are going to be taken forward.
If I want to add something, I think even the institutional landscape is much more complex than that. Because now we have, this from the public sector or from the state, this very fragmented perspective, and ministries competing for resources. Now we have cases that ministries of forestry are competing with ministries of agriculture and ministries of water for resources, because they are competing for economic rents, and also they are making a living out of that. But what adds more complexity is that you have different levels of government as well. You have central government that they are not necessarily aligned their perspectives with the local governments. So you have cases in even which decentralization has added much more complexity to this problem of soil management. And even now you have what we were discussing in the previous session, these corporate actors that may have having much more influence in some cases, in some countries, and probably replacing the state. So I think the whole institutional landscape is much more complex, and we should dedicate much more thinking about how do we do with that.
And I think also deciding that you're going to push decision-making and planning down to the lowest possible level, because at that low level, you've usually got much less of a clear distinction between different departments seeking to establish their interest over others. I mean, for a farmer, his soil, his water, his land, his grazing land, I mean, it's all part of a single space. It's not divided into lots of separate categories.
Right, and that was exactly my point, that to the extent that you go to the local level and you meet smallholders that are not necessarily have been changing too much their practices, because they are also changing their practices and moving from the rural areas to the urban, etc. You have a lot of interaction with rural-urban. But in cases in which they have been attached more to their practices, or family agriculture in Brazil, etc., they have a more holistic approaches about the way in which they manage the plots. And I think we are recognizing from the different sectors, and coming from the forestry sector, that we can not longer talk about forestry without looking at the whole process of management of the farms.
Yeah.
Which is the same thing that if you go to the global, or to the national, to the global level. And that's a challenge for us, and it's a challenge for the states, in the way in which they have to promote these transitions.
Yeah, yeah. And so many of the things that we need to do need to take place at that global level rather than at the national as well.
Exactly, and that's bringing the institutional dimensions to the Nexus debate, which is very important.
Well, thank you very much, Pablo. I'm now going to turn to my panel, who've been very patient, listening, contributing small nuggets, but otherwise holding back. And I wanted you to give us, in maybe a few minutes, imagine looking forward to 2016. So 3 years ahead, you're planning the Global Soil Week in 2016. So we've been through 2014, we've been through 2015, big year, Climate Change Convention, post-SDGs, International Year of Soil, hopefully. So what do you think we will have achieved by 2016? What's your dream? What's your ambition for 2016? That you're going to be arriving here in Berlin, and what do you really hope for? What do you dream for? Mujahid.
Thank you. It's a good question and a difficult question. And I missed also to say at this is sometimes we are also competing as scientists or as researchers. And what I will look for forward is really an integration or an integrated effort of all of us that to see what we talk about sustainable land management. When we say sustainable land management, that all, let's say, involved sectors, subsectors, and stakeholders are contributing to this SLM. To some extent, I see SLM now still fragmented, and I see several, let's say, different or multiplicity of approaches. Sometimes they're competing, or sometimes, I cannot sometimes see even the difference between them. Adding to some of them. If now we converge towards really a real sustainable land management, when we talk a little bit about the soil, giving it the importance that it requires and it deserves, that's what I'm looking for. People now, they find out, they understood, because for years, for them, soil is there. What's the problem? What's the problem with soil? Soil is, now they understood that with these growing populations, with the problems that we are facing with water, with climate change, with erosion, with desertification. All these now are giving much more importance to soils. And this, I guess, it's also giving space for all involved in these subsectors to come together and to look into it in just one block of things to do together. This is what I look forward, and I don't accuse only politicians, but I guess it's our role to take it up to them so that they understand what we are talking about.
Great. Now, I think that's a very good summary of our need for a really strong collective effort. When we're divided, then the message is fragmented. If we're together, then our voice can be 1,000 times stronger. Martin, what's your...
Yes, thank you very much. Before going to the answer of this question, I would like to come back in two issues from where I will be able to answer the question. The first one is, I hope Professor Lal will agree with me, that in Africa, the agricultural system, if you want to change it now, because it's no longer sustainable, you need an input for farmers to change their practice now. And this input, you can either call it incentive or you call it subsidy. This is the most important thing for me. We need this input. You can call it a subsidy, or some people can call it a subsidy. You can call it incentive. It doesn't mind. We need that input. And that's why even now we are trying to see whether from the environmental process perspective you can develop some more land use system that can contribute to emission reduction, from where the farmer can get some input to improve the agricultural system. I think in that point we agree that we need something, and this is very important in order to achieve a sustainable management of soil in that condition. I think that's the first one. The second thing I would like to also to write here is this complex issue of managing the relationship between soil and other land factors, such as water, vegetation, climate, and land user. Complex in that sense. On the other side, several stakeholders, scientists, farmers, decision makers, governance. These people, the problem, how to create a system to combine, to put soil at each of these levels and speak the same language. Talk with people from different backgrounds and understand each other. In that case, I think somebody raised the issue of involving the media. Maybe I think the media will help us very much in breaking down our jargon, scientific jargon, to something very understandable from all us stakeholders. I think if by this time we can try to make a sort of system where the media, the communication system, can easily break down our knowledge and put it in such a way anyone of the system, this complex system, can easily understand it. I think it will be something very good. It's also, that's why we raise the issue of data and communication, dissemination of research. We don't do it. Maybe some people, they don't have data because the way we are putting it now is not necessary what they need. So for me, we focus on communication, the language, simple language to communicate with the other stakeholder. I hope it will be, that will be my expectation by this time. And anything, incentive or whatever, to boost the change in land use system for a more sustainable way in Africa.
Great. Thank you, Martin, very much.
So aspirations, huh?
Yeah. Dream, Johan.
Dreams. Yeah, well, it's tough. You know the quote about conferences, I tend to say it now and then, that the conference is a gathering of people who individually can do nothing and collectively can decide that nothing can be done. I don't want us to end up there, that's for sure. You asked me before if I had any perspectives from SCI. I will sort of try to talk around some areas, some experiences I have from the research we are doing, coming to the aspirations. First of all, it would be great if we by 2016 know what we are talking about when we talk about the Nexus, first of all. I think that would be interesting. We are mixing things now. We are mixing resources, sectors, systems, and how they are interconnected. I think getting a clarification of that would be actually quite important. We have talked about language a lot and the fact that we are misunderstanding each other, and we talk about we mean different things but with the same words, and that's the key thing. And we need to get there because SDGs are so broad. We are outside of sort of the technical disciplines. We really need to get all different people on board. So I think that is really key, and to understand that. But I also really, building on the fact, yesterday when we met, Camilla, when we had also a meeting last night, you said, that Copenhagen 2009 was really a nightmare, the climate negotiations. I think it was a great success.
Because it forced us to understand how tough it was going to be.
Exactly. Because the thing is, as long as you just, trickle around on the surface, it's not very interesting. But suddenly in Copenhagen, we started to understand that the world is changing. We have new actors coming up. We have to stop talking about developing countries. I mean, it's old systems that are really stuck from the 1970s, which are not valid any longer. Suddenly trade became an issue. And understanding economic development and what shapes the future. So learning from that, I really hope by 2016 that we dare to address, within the framework of the SDGs, what really are the drivers of change when it comes to natural resources. That's not poverty alleviation. I mean, that's the minimum. It's that 10% to lift people, that level. Again, we are talking about the move, hopefully, of 1.5 billion people to 6 billion people to middle-class conditions to 2030. And if we can have an agenda by 2016 that really dares to address that success, because that is a success on the human dimension, that would be interesting. And then I'm coming back to some of the points I made before, and that we also conclude from our research, is that we have to understand that consumer choices make a huge impact in different parts of the world. That if the EU decides that we should have 40% bioenergy, it has enormous impact in Southeast Asia or in Latin America. So interdependencies must be part of this agenda. Externalities, to understand how we are exporting sometimes problems. The fact that we are talking about decoupling our economies in Europe, I would question to a certain degree. We decouple it locally, not globally. But also the whole issue of policy coherence, and the SDG, for the first time, potentially make it possible for us to really strategically talk about policy coherence in all these different fields. And if we are there in 2016 and sort of dare to touch upon these very, very politically touchy issues, and I really look forward to do that in partnership, not least with the Soil Forum and IASS and other organizations, then I really believe that we are heading for a great future.
Okay. Fingers crossed.
Yes.
Thank you. Maria.
Thank you. Thank you, Camilla. I don't know if I should speak about illusion of aspirations, but it doesn't matter. I will express my thoughts on this. I think that in 2016 would be interesting to have a section where we assess what we have achieved, the discussion that has been started with the first forum on global soil that I think was last year. So in 2016 will be after 5 years of this conference. And to my opinion, we should discuss how we have started to make this interoperability between the different issues in the nexus that we have discussed today also. And namely, I would say that we should have overpassed the difference between soil and land, but we should consider this as an ecosystem service that is doing or providing to the different citizens and population service like food, water, and urban area, rural area, development, and so on. And it's clear that the land will be under a great pressure because there are all these issues that are coming together, and we have also the climate change issues to be considered. So we have to make awareness to the populations about the resilience that we need to have in comparison to the climate change issues, to the use of the land and soil that I want to consider ecosystem service. So this was on the point. And maybe we could also exploit the Expo 2015 that is dedicated to feeding the planet. And feeding the planet does not mean to create food for 9 billion of people in the future, but means also to make awareness in the population of a nutrition, different nutrition way, different source of proteins, different use of the environmental resources. And also we should look at the economic circular economy. I mean, we should consider waste. We should try to limit the use of food, and we should try to limit the waste and to recycle products, and also to look at the value of the products, the raw products, and how we have to have a sustainable production and also consumption. So I hope that all these issues that are very much linked to the use of soils and lands could be actually addressed in the next 3 years before 2016, and in the next Global Forum of 2016 we might have a section where we assess all the practical issues, the practical actions that have been taken in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Maria. So hopefully in 2016, instead of deciding there's nothing to be done, we'll be celebrating at what's been achieved. Fon, what about you?
What about me? So, 2016, we want to see hopeful indicators of local initiatives of gaining ground in securing water resources and systems, in securing energy sources and systems, in securing food production resources and systems. And this can be done via locally owned actions, which are supported by colleges, universities, the scientific and research communities, and policies. I think we have just too many, hundreds and thousands of young people who can volunteer in doing something, who are not exploited. If you take the case of Africa in particular, the number of Africans who strive to come to Europe, both legally and illegally, for which their knowledge and their experiences are not used. If you can transform all of these capacities in Africa into some form of volunteering work with some support, we'll be amazed by the transformations that will happen. And I take the case of my organization, how we started, leaving university in 1992. We had the option also, 5 of us who started my organization, to hope to come to Europe, and we never did, and still we're not doing that. In that process, we started from a compost making small initiative without an office, without tools, without any money. So that's actually how we started. So it was 5 of us. It's amazing to let you know that this initiative actually had looked at the time as a good investment. It has looked at a bad investment in education, a good example of a bad investment in education, because you assume 5 university graduates without job, but they are in a compost pit, in urban waste management, urban waste disposal site, struggling to recuperate manure to use as compost. My presence here is linked to that background. It's not only my presence here linked to that background, but the contributions which we have made in our country also in some aspects of land use and land policy reforms is linked to this local and practical knowledge. There is too much that we're losing from this practical side of people, bringing into their communities from learning. And so a lot of learning, maybe I'll put it, remain virtual because people learn but not apply. So how do we get this application of knowledge? In applying knowledge, there's even more knowledge which is generated, especially when we do local level action, bottom-up actions, approaches which would link to local ownership systems, because the local people also, they have knowledge. And building, sharing with them what we learn in school and learning from them what they are doing, really, there are a lot of things that we can gain from this. And if we use the systems, we'll have a lot more what we call resource-efficient approaches. Resource-efficient approaches in terms of human resources, in terms of knowledge application, which can be supported also now with material and finances. This is a big challenge to the university community, which is here, and the international donor community. When I look at the issue of RED in our country, how much money has been put on the processes, so without processes we don't make progress. But if we have upstream processes, then we don't make progress. If we have downstream processes, then we make a lot of progress. The amount of money which has been put into RED systems and no action is on the ground, to the best of my knowledge. We need to rethink. We need to rethink. So if we have to, and really we must, show a lot of results by indicators, then local investment in local actions should be the ultimate. We are faced with two challenges. One, there is a procedure and state protocol. How do you surpass that? Because the FAO will say, okay, we are an intergovernmental organization, so we work through the governments. And where the governments and FAO are trapped in bureaucracy, more and more areas are suffering from land degradation, more areas suffering from water loss, and from energy systems which are being destroyed. So how do you balance these procedural and bureaucratic gaps, and also to move on with the communities where the local actions are needed? So it's all the challenge that we face, think globally and act locally. We must surpass these gaps. Thank you.
Great. Well, I think that's a very heartfelt but also timely reminder, bringing us right back down to earth, and think about the things that might help get that momentum going at that level, with states often very unwilling to let go, but at the same time also recognizing that it's got a very large youthful population that also need to be mobilized into positive, constructive activity that can make a difference. We've got a few minutes left, and I'd like to take maybe a few comments from the floor about maybe some of your own dreams and aspirations as well before I wrap up. Yes, sir. Mike here. Maybe if we take 3 or 4 comments. So.
Thank you. I would like to comment that sustainable land management or sustainable land and water management should be looked at from the food security perspective. That's where it is linked to food security, and that's where the policy should also concentrate. Why? Land degradation in the developing world is more the issue of the poor. Empty stomachs do not care about land degradation. That's why our farmers are actually cultivating on 60–50% slopes. Therefore, the food security policy should make sure that land and water management should be actually strategized so that the poor are also addressed. Let me share a simple example from my country, Ethiopia. Back in 2005, we have been failing with land degradation, rehabilitation, and so on. Back in 2005, we sat with all our stakeholders, international stakeholders, and developed actually sustainable land management agenda, especially from the watershed basis, starting from the top up to the end. And there we also had incentives. What are these incentives? Instead of actually addressing the food insecure population through food handouts, we started actually delivering those handouts for community asset building. What is that? Farmers are engaged, able-bodied households are engaged in community land rehabilitation activities, and they get something in return. Now, 10 years on, we have actually rehabilitated thousands of hectares of land, while at the same time, about 1.3 million farmers' households have graduated from food insecurity and become food self-sufficient. And some of these degraded environments are now even contesting for carbon fund. So by 2016, can we say that developing countries do have an appropriate sustainable land management agenda and strategy that they have started implementing? Ethiopia, we have become exemplary, and about 12 African countries have adopted the strategy that we have followed. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's an excellent example of how the whole approach to social protection measures have become much more sophisticated and much more linked to achieving broader goals. And I certainly salute the way in which the government of Ethiopia has put green economy and climate resilience as a very central part of its economic development strategy. I've got a hand just there, sir. Yep. Can you pass the... Oh, you've got it. Great.
Oh, thank you very much.
Can you say who you are?
My name is Theophilus Ngitila from Namibia. I'm the Environmental Commissioner. I just would like to say a few points with regard to sustainable land management. First of all, I just wish to invite the delegates about the outcome of COP11 that just concluded in Namibia a few weeks ago. And more importantly is the Namib Declaration as part of that outcome of COP11, which clearly outlined what the focus will be as Namibia is the presidency of COP11 for next 2 years, what the focus we would like to see, in particular for the strengthening of UNCCD to be able to take forward and ensure that at least there is an element regarding the land degradation neutral world within the framework of sustainable development goals that is under preparations. Secondly is the issue of focusing to local community, which is very important. And we have experience in this in terms of the implementation of the Convention of Combating Desertification in Namibia. Communities are the main users of land resources. And when it comes to land and soil, community is inseparable. So that means we really need to ensure their full participation on the issues related to land and soil. And also, when it comes to research, it's so important that we need to adopt research in concert with the community and the research that make common sense to the community livelihood. And that is very important to ensure sustainable land management and productivity, enhancing productivity. Secondly is the issue of empowering women, which is very key because women, especially in Africa, which is also vulnerable when it comes to land degradation, the women 24 hours almost are on the land, and they are the main custodian of the land resources. And I think focusing on empowering them is a critical aspect. Also important is the science policy interface. And I'm glad that one of the outcomes of COP11 is to establish this active or facility to ensure there is science which actually linking and guiding better management of land. And lastly is the engagement of private sector, not only agroforestry, but also other sectors in particular that are engaging in food production. I thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. Can I take another couple of points. Yes, the lady here.
Jasmine Black from Newcastle University. I'm a PhD student. I just want to highlight a point that came up at the end of the land management discussion session with some of my colleagues here. We were talking about educating the public and consumers as this could be a critical mass to make change. And I think it's very important that we do that in a positive light and show soil as a dynamic and exciting substance, which it is. And I think as scientists, we have a responsibility to communicate our science in understandable terms, and that's something that we shouldn't shirk off responsibility for.
Great, thanks very much. Lady here.
Hello, Andrea Kosh from the US Studies Centre at Sydney University. And I just wanted to go back to the summary that Ambassador Walter made on the session where we were addressing land degradation neutral as a goal for sustainable development. And he mentioned that we discussed the need for targets and indicators, and there was some debate as to whether there would be many or one. And one thing that wasn't captured in his summary was the fact that a number of people raised as a potential, if there was to be just one indicator or one leading indicator, that soil carbon or soil organic carbon is a contender for that. This is positive from a number of perspectives. Firstly, that it's simple. Politicians and indeed the general public already understand carbon from climate change debates. It also indicates all the other positive outcomes that we're looking for in land management and soil management, for example, productivity, freshwater, biodiversity, ecosystem service delivery. We already have examples of it across the developed and the developing world, including the World Bank's soil carbon methodology in Kenya, which has been implemented by 60,000 farmers across 45,000 hectares and has been successful in increasing yields by 12 to 13% and sequestering 1.9 million tonnes of carbon dioxide. And the last point is that the fourth pillar of the intergovernmental technical working panel for the GSP is working on the design of a global soil monitoring system, and we already know through that work that we do and we will measure soil carbon. So I just wanted to make that point that soil carbon is something that we can focus on, and it has a whole range of benefits. So if we can be thinking about that and starting to achieve that in 2016, that will be amazing.
Well, thank you very much. I see Professor Lal wants to have the last word, so if we pass him the mic.
Thank you. I agree with what Andrea just mentioned, but I want to come back to Dr. Martin Yemefek. You are very right. On a continental scale, sub-Saharan Africa is nutrient mining 50 to 60 kilogram of NPK per hectare per year. And this has been going on for the last 50 years. So somehow that trend has to be reversed. The fertilizer used in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa is 8 kilogram per hectare, compared to more than 400 in China, 200 in US, and 110 in India. The irrigation rate in sub-Saharan Africa is 5% of what is potentially irrigable. So it is just about the time to reverse the trend. Africa has a vast diversity of ample endowment of natural resources. They really need to be utilized properly. And I think one of the ways is to sequester carbon perhaps in soil and pay farmers for the ecosystem services to mitigate and adapt climate change.
Great, well, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to let those arguments go on over tea, so do please pick on a panel member that you want to catch up with or who you want to have an argument with. For me, that's been enormously helpful in terms of hearing how these different threads have been weaving through your debates over the last day or two. I hope very much it will turn into a really vibrant tapestry that allows us to move forward together on a joint agenda. I've heard a number of key points. One is around the need to get more political, the need to get more engaged, the need to bring together a much broader constituency. I must say, I hadn't realized that NGOs like Oxfam were going to be here. I think that reaching out and engagement with people who aren't necessarily in the soil science and soil policy community is a key part of that, and finding a way in which you can use the media to get those messages out much more broadly. I think another key thing that I'd like to see by 2016 is really starting to value natural capital and ecosystems, not only in terms of recognizing the value of what you're losing, but also recognizing the value of investments being made very often by hundreds of millions of small farmers, and finding a way in which that value creation in terms of water, biodiversity, and carbon can receive an incentive. I think we also need to be ambitious. We've heard the importance of going for big, universal, global targets around things like zero hunger, zero poverty, around trying to build circular economies. I think that's a really important set of messages to take into the SDG agenda. And I think we've also got to focus very much on global interdependencies. I've been hugely buoyed up by the move from this kind of north-south discussion, developing MDG-style debate that we had 10, 15 years ago, to one which, to me, represents very much more the world that we actually live in, which is that we share a single planet no matter where we actually live, and the actions and interactions of each of us do have an impact very often on the other side of the globe. And that means that we need to be addressing issues of poverty and underconsumption on the one hand, but also issues of overconsumption, waste, and resource depletion on the others. And I think that our political classes need to really have the courage to be able to understand how we build a different sort of world where we've got real planetary boundaries, and we have to learn how to share the prosperity that this Mother Earth can provide us with. So on that point, can I say thank you very much for being a very great audience, lots of questions. I'd like to thank very much our THREAD ambassadors for having taken us through, in some detail, but very necessary detail, the discussions that you've been bringing to this forum. And I'd like to thank our panelists very much for giving us the wisdom and their thoughts and their dreams. So thank you very much.